At a wedding, the groom humiliated the bride in front of all the guests by slapping her right at the altar, but he didn't know who was behind his back. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're from. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the sheer white curtains of Naomi's bedroom, casting warm streaks across the hardwood floor. Her bare feet made no sound as she moved through the room, the hem of her robe brushing lightly against her ankles. The apartment was quiet, still caught in the fragile breath of dawn before the chaos of the day would descend. In the distance, the muffled sounds of early Atlanta traffic hummed like a distant drumbeat, steady, predictable, and unconcerned with the weight pressing on her chest. Naomi exhaled slowly and leaned against the windowsill. From this height, she could see the city waking up. Joggers cutting across sidewalks, vendors opening shutters, buses pulling into intersections. Life marched on below, unaware that today was meant to be the most important day of her life. She clutched the window frame tightly. Her hands were trembling. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more elusive, a tension that had no name but had made a home in the pit of her stomach over the last few weeks. She had dismissed it again and again, each time with a little more desperation. It was just nerves. Everyone got nervous before their wedding. Everyone doubted themselves a little. That was normal, wasn't it? She glanced at her phone. 2 missed calls from her mother, 1 message from the wedding planner, and a flood of unread texts, emojis, and exclamations from friends. Naomi didn't open any of them. She simply turned the phone over, face down, and sat on the edge of the bed. The dress was already hanging in the next room. Custom-made ivory silk, hand-stitched lace, a train that whispered royalty. Every thread a promise, every detail chosen with care. Naomi had spent months planning, measuring, imagining herself in it. Her younger self would have wept with joy to see it now. Her mother, Janice, had offered to stay with her the night before, but Naomi had declined. She needed the solitude. Or perhaps she had known that even her mother's warm, steady presence wouldn't quiet the dissonance growing in her heart. She closed her eyes and tried to think of Austin. Austin, with his perfectly styled blonde hair and quicksilver smile. With his well-cut suits and the kind of confidence that never seemed rehearsed. The man who had swept into her life like a breeze through an open door, charming her friends, earning polite approval from her colleagues, and ultimately dropping to one knee in the middle of a crowded art gala with a ring that sparkled like the night sky. He had said all the right things, done all the right things. He'd held her hand during her mother's surgery, had taken her to meet his parents in Vermont, had brought flowers to her office just because. He spoke about children. He said she inspired him. And yet, there were moments, little things, jokes that didn't land quite right. A strange hesitance when they visited her family, the way he introduced her as his beautiful, strong-willed fiancée, with a strange emphasis on the word. She told herself she was reading too much into it, that every relationship had adjustments, that love meant compromise. Naomi rose and walked into the adjoining room where the dress waited for her. Her mother would be arriving any minute now with the hairstylist. Soon, the apartment would be filled with laughter, with clinking champagne glasses, with the dizzying rhythm of wedding morning rituals. But for now, she stood alone in the quiet, staring at the symbol of a future she was about to enter. She thought of her father. Sergeant Marcus Ellison had died when Naomi was 9. His picture still sat on her mother's mantel, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, with eyes that seemed to look through you and into something deeper. She remembered the tight hugs he used to give her, The way he smelled of metal and cedar, and how he would lift her high into the air, whispering, "You are mine, and you are mighty." After his death, it was her grandfather who became the anchor of the family, General Lawrence Matthews, a name that carried weight in military circles, whispered in newsrooms, printed in memoirs. A man who had served in 2 wars, risen through the ranks without compromise, and commanded not just soldiers, but silence. Because when he entered a room, people listened. He had always been distant with her, not unkind, but controlled, formal, precise. While Janice filled Naomi's life with warmth and softness, her grandfather was all lines and order and steel. Yet there had always been something in his gaze, something watchful, protective, unflinching. He had not spoken much when Naomi introduced him to Austin. A handshake, a nod, and very few words. Naomi had excused it as generational distance. Austin, to his credit, had tried to impress him, talking about his business, his plans for the future. But General Matthews had simply sat back, quiet, his eyes saying what his lips did not. Still, he hadn't objected. He had come to the engagement dinner, sent a formal letter of congratulations, and RSVP'd to the wedding invitation with one simple word: attending. Naomi wondered now if his silence had been a kind of waiting. There was a knock at the door. Her mother stepped in, dressed immaculately in a navy blue ensemble, her short hair pinned back, her eyes scanning her daughter with concern masked as a smile. "I brought coffee," Janice said, lifting the paper cup. "Your favorite." Naomi tried to return the smile, but only managed a nod. Janice set the cup down and moved toward her slowly, the way a parent approaches a child too old to be comforted with a hug. "You okay?" "Yes, just the gravity of it all." Her mother tilted her head, studying her. "You don't have to go through with anything that doesn't feel right." Naomi laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, the guests are already arriving. The dress is hanging right there. I can't just—" "You can do whatever you choose," Janice said firmly. "This is your life, not an event." "I love him," Naomi said, and the words came out like a question she hoped her mother would confirm. Janice didn't speak. She simply walked to the window and pulled the curtain back, letting in more light. The room seemed to sharpen around the edges, as though shadows had been pushed aside. "I just want you to be respected," her mother said after a long pause. "That's all." Naomi stood in front of the mirror, her reflection framed in gold. She tried to see herself as a bride, as someone stepping into a fairy tale. But all she saw was a woman balancing on a ledge, holding her breath. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur. Hair was done, makeup applied. Friends arrived, full of compliments and selfies and giddy whispers. The planner fussed over the final details. The bouquet was delivered, white orchids with eucalyptus, just as Naomi had envisioned. And then the car ride to the venue, a sprawling estate nestled among rolling hills, where white tents fluttered in the breeze, and rows of chairs gleamed under the spring sun. Musicians tuned their instruments. Guests milled about in designer suits and pastel dresses. Every corner was touched by elegance. Austin stood at the end of the aisle, radiant in a tailored tuxedo, his smile broad and camera-ready. When Naomi stepped out of the car, every eye turned to her. The music swelled, her heart pounded. She looked for her grandfather. He was there, sitting quietly in the back row, dressed in a dark military-cut suit adorned with a single medal. His posture perfect, his gaze unreadable. Naomi met his eyes for a brief second. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just looked at her, and in that gaze she felt something ancient and powerful, something that didn't need to speak to be heard. She turned her face forward and stepped onto the white carpet. Everything ahead of her glowed, but somewhere deep inside, the trembling hadn't stopped. And neither had the silence. The scent of lilacs and garden roses drifted on the afternoon breeze as Naomi stepped down from the vintage silver Rolls-Royce that had brought her to the estate. She adjusted her train slightly, catching the soft rustle of fabric beneath her heels. As she looked around, it struck her again how beautiful everything was. The estate grounds stretched like a manicured dream. Sweeping lawns, flowered arches, marble fountains, white-clothed tables beneath strings of fairy lights waiting for dusk. Every detail had been executed exactly as she had envisioned. And yet, as she walked slowly toward the bridal suite, flanked by her bridesmaids and the wedding coordinator, that same tight knot she'd felt in the early morning hours returned, subtle but persistent. Smiles surrounded her and words of excitement filled the air, but Naomi felt as though she were walking through glass, everything close, everything sharp, yet somehow distant. Her vision, her day, her life, moving forward on rails she could no longer stop. Inside the bridal suite, a makeup artist was doing final touch-ups, and someone brought her water with lemon. Her mother kissed her on the cheek, murmuring, "Almost there, baby." The bridesmaids fussed with the veil, straightened the buttons along the back of her gown, laughed as they teased each other about the groomsmen. Naomi responded when spoken to, nodded when asked questions, smiled for the photographer who circled them like a hummingbird. She looked the part. She performed the part. But her eyes kept flicking to the tall French doors that overlooked the gathering crowd. She knew Austin was out there. Somewhere. He would be standing in front of the floral altar right now, rehearsing the lines he'd say, straightening his cufflinks, practicing his camera-ready grin. Naomi had seen that grin so many times. It came so easily to him, like breathing. The same grin he wore in every social situation, whether making a toast or deflecting a question. It was charming, sure, but it had always seemed to Naomi to lack depth, like something memorized rather than lived. She didn't want to dwell on doubts. Not today. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. A single message from her best friend, Yara, flashed across the screen. "You look like a queen. Let no one forget it." Naomi felt a sudden wave of gratitude. She needed that reminder. She needed to believe that the woman in the mirror, elegant, poised, regal, was truly her. Downstairs, in the room reserved for the groom and his party, Austin stood in front of a full-length mirror, turning slightly from side to side as he admired his reflection. His best man, Kyle, handed him a tumbler of whiskey. The other men were laughing, adjusting their ties, checking their hair. Austin chuckled along with them, but occasionally glanced down at his phone. He had posted a photo earlier, a close-up of Naomi's hand wearing the engagement ring with the caption, "Forever starts today." Hundreds of likes had flooded in within minutes. Kyle leaned toward him, lowering his voice. "You ready for this?" Austin smirked. "Please, I've been ready." There was a beat of silence before another groomsman, Eric, cleared his throat. "So, any nerves? At all?" Austin shrugged and took a sip of whiskey. "It's a wedding. It's not war." The men chuckled, except for Kyle, whose expression flickered briefly. "Just saying," Austin continued. "I've survived board meetings with bloodthirsty investors. I can handle a flower aisle and some teary vows." Eric snorted. "And a general for a grandfather-in-law." That drew laughter from the room. Austin raised his glass. "To survive in the brass." Only Kyle didn't laugh. Austin noticed. "What?" "Nothing. Kyle said. Just maybe cool it with the jokes during the ceremony. Her grandfather's old school. Could probably kill a man with his thumb. Austin rolled his eyes. He's like 80, and probably still sharper than you, Kyle said under his breath. Austin waved him off. Relax. I know how to work a crowd. Back upstairs, Naomi stood in front of the mirror, veil now secured in her hair. Her mother held her hand, quietly humming the tune she used to sing to her when Naomi was a child. The photographer signaled that it was time. The processional would begin in minutes. Naomi's heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. The coordinator's voice rang out from the hallway. Everyone in position, please. As Naomi made her way down the staircase toward the garden, she saw the rows of chairs filling quickly. The air was buzzing with conversation and anticipation. People turned to look at her, their faces lighting up. She was the bride. She was the vision. She found her place behind the final floral arch, just out of sight from the audience. The music changed. The bridesmaids began walking down the aisle in soft sage green. Her mother stepped forward, kissed her one last time, then took her seat. And then it was Naomi's turn. She stepped forward onto the white carpet. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Cameras rose, smiles bloomed, and there, at the end of the aisle, stood Austin, handsome and poised, beaming. Her gaze, almost against her will, flicked to the far end of the first row. There he was, General Lawrence Matthews, ramrod straight in his seat, hands folded neatly in his lap. He wore a dark suit with a single row of military decorations pinned to his chest. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his face unreadable. His eyes met hers and held them. He did not smile. Naomi turned her gaze back to Austin and walked forward. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke eloquently, inviting all gathered to witness the union of two souls. Naomi and Austin stood side by side, hands clasped, their faces arranged in the expected expressions. They exchanged vows. Naomi's voice was soft but steady as she spoke of trust, of love, of partnership. Austin smiled, leaned toward the microphone, and began. Naomi, he said, when I first met you, I thought you were a challenge. The audience chuckled politely. Naomi blinked. She felt his thumb press lightly against her hand as if to say, go with it. I'd never dated someone like you before, Austin continued, glancing at the crowd. You were fierce, sharp, opinionated. You pushed back on everything. Another wave of polite laughter. And I thought, this one's going to make me work for it. A few people laughed more freely. Naomi tried to smile. Something inside her started to curdle. But I won you over. Eventually, I wore you down. And here we are. The officiant shifted uncomfortably. Naomi's mother furrowed her brow. In the back row, General Matthews did not move. Austin wasn't finished. People told me it would be complicated. You know, different backgrounds, different experiences. But I always believed love could overcome anything. Even the opinions of friends, family, Twitter. More laughter. Naomi's throat tightened. And honestly, it hasn't always been easy, Austin added, especially having a future father-in-law who could probably take me out with a paperclip. The laughter this time was louder. Naomi's smile was frozen. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being patient with me while I adjusted to your world, to your expectations, your family dynamics, your fire. She felt her fingers twitch in his grip. I know I'm not perfect. I know I've made mistakes. I've said things. I've joked around. But you've been gracious. You've let me in. And then he did something no one expected. He reached up, cupped her cheek, and with a smirk that curled at the edges, gave her a light, audible slap. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. He leaned into the microphone. "Just making sure I'm still dreaming." Silence. Naomi didn't move. Her cheek stung, her mind reeled. She felt eyes on her from every direction. Her mother had risen slightly in her seat. The bridesmaids stood frozen. The officiant opened his mouth but said nothing. And in the back row, slowly, deliberately, General Matthews rose to his feet. Naomi could not breathe. For several seconds the world stood still. Naomi's cheek pulsed with heat where Austin's hand had met her skin. The sound of the slap still echoed faintly, even though the birds had gone quiet and the breeze had stilled. It was as if the garden itself, lush and decorated in white florals and gold ribbons, had paused in disbelief. The audience, once a sea of warm faces and quiet admiration, was now a silent assembly of eyes wide and mouths parted. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Austin, standing beside her with a self-satisfied grin, seemed oblivious to the shift in the air. His hand had fallen back to his side, casual, relaxed, as if nothing had happened. As if what he had just done wasn't shocking, humiliating, and viciously wrong. His eyes darted briefly toward the crowd and then returned to Naomi's frozen face. "You're so serious," he said with a chuckle into the microphone. "I was only joking." But the words dropped like stones into a well. No one laughed, not even the groomsmen, who had earlier smirked at his every smug remark. Even they now looked uneasy, eyes flickering between Naomi and Austin, unsure of what was unfolding, unsure if they should be laughing or intervening or retreating altogether. Naomi didn't speak. Her body remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some undefined point just beyond Austin's shoulder. Her breath was shallow, but she forced it to steady. Every instinct in her screamed to move, to walk away, to disappear, but she didn't. She couldn't. Not yet. Her fingers had gone cold in his. She heard her mother's sharp intake of breath somewhere in the front row. Janice had half risen from her chair, one hand pressed to her lips. One of the bridesmaids had taken a step forward from her place, eyes filled with horror, but stopped herself when she realized Naomi hadn't moved. Naomi could feel the collective weight of their gazes, 100 people watching her, waiting for her reaction. But she didn't give them what they expected. Instead, she lifted her chin ever so slightly and turned her head toward the audience. Her eyes swept across the rows, searching for only one face. And there he was, General Lawrence Matthews. Standing now, tall and unshaken, his dark suit cut a severe figure against the pastel colors of the wedding decor. The medals on his chest caught a glint of sunlight, and, though he made no sound, the silence around him thickened. His face was carved from granite. No fury, no surprise, no softness. Just the immovable calm of a man who had seen worse and endured more, and who now looked at the scene before him with the solemn judgment of a battlefield commander. He began to walk. Not fast, not dramatic. Each step was deliberate, controlled, precise. He moved down the center aisle as if it belonged to him, because in that moment it did. People moved instinctively out of his way, standing aside without even realizing it. Guests who moments ago had been fixed in their seats now parted like water around a stone. Naomi did not blink. Austin finally seemed to sense that something was wrong, that the air had grown heavy and charged, that the slap, which he had perhaps imagined as a quirky, edgy gesture, a joke, a performance, had crossed an invisible, irreversible line. He turned, slightly, confused by the silence, and followed the line of Naomi's gaze. Only then did he see the man approaching. The expression on Austin's face faltered for the first time all day. General Matthews did not raise his voice. He did not rush. He did not threaten. He simply reached the altar and stood there, between the bride and groom and the audience. His presence was louder than any outburst could have been. The officiant, clearly overwhelmed, stepped back to give the man space, clutching his notes like a shield. Austin tried to speak. "Sir, I think you're—" The words died in his throat. The general's eyes met his. They were cold, unblinking, and full of something ancient and terrible, not rage, not disappointment, something deeper, something that said, "You have made a mistake you will never walk back from." Naomi stepped aside. She did not look at Austin again. Her fingers dropped from his hand, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she moved, elegant, slow, and silent. The general did not turn his gaze from Austin. The silence was unbearable. Every person in the audience was leaning forward without knowing it, holding their breath, clutching their programs or bouquets, transfixed by what would come next. And then, without a word, without warning, General Matthews' right hand rose and struck Austin across the face with the full, restrained force of a man trained in control, in discipline, in exactitude. The sound was clean and final, a sound of reckoning. Austin stumbled backward, stunned. His hand shot to his cheek, his mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes darted to the guests as if seeking some validation, some defense, but none came. The groomsman stood frozen. His parents, seated near the front, stared in wide-eyed disbelief. Even the waitstaff, standing near the back with trays of champagne, stood still, witnessing something they would never forget. The general lowered his hand slowly and turned to his granddaughter. She stood just a few feet away, facing him. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither said anything. Then, very softly, the general extended his arm. Naomi stepped forward, took it, and allowed him to guide her down the aisle, not as a bride escorted toward a new life, but as a woman reclaimed from humiliation by the quiet, impenetrable love of the man who had always watched, always waited, and who now acted when it mattered most. They walked past the rows of guests, past the shocked whispers and fluttering hands. No music played, no words followed. Only footsteps on the white runner and the soft breeze rustling the floral arches. When they reached the end of the aisle, the general held the door open for her. Naomi turned briefly to look back at the garden. The altar, the flowers, the man still standing at the front, alone and disoriented, surrounded by the debris of a wedding that had turned into something else entirely. Then she turned back, her face unreadable, and walked into the mansion. The door closed behind them with a quiet, definitive click. Inside, the foyer was cool and dim. Naomi leaned slightly against the wall, her breath shaky. The general did not touch her, did not speak. He simply stood nearby, giving her space. After a long silence, he finally said, "You are not broken." Naomi's throat tightened. She hadn't realized she was crying until she tasted salt on her lips. He didn't offer a handkerchief. He didn't offer platitudes. He just waited. She inhaled deeply. Her voice, when it came, was low but clear. "I didn't want to see it. I know. I made excuses. I thought if I just loved him enough. He never deserved that kind of love." She turned to him. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I wanted you to see him for yourself. Because one day he would show you who he really was. And I wanted you to remember that I trusted you to see it." She nodded slowly. Outside, the murmurs of guests were rising, a storm of confusion and speculation. But inside, within these walls, there was only stillness, and something beginning to shift. Something that felt, for the first time that day, like clarity. Naomi straightened her shoulders. She had not walked down the aisle to a husband, but she had walked away from something far worse. And, in the process, she had walked toward herself. The hush that had fallen over the wedding lingered long after Naomi and her grandfather disappeared behind the carved oak doors of the estate. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of stillness that followed a clap of thunder, the stunned, ears-ringing aftermath when people aren't quite sure whether to speak, move, or pretend they hadn't seen what they had. Guests sat frozen in their seats, hands on their laps, lips parted mid-whisper, eyes darting between the altar and the now closed doors, unsure whether they should rise or remain seated, whether to stay or leave, whether the ceremony was over or merely interrupted. At the front, Austin remained standing where the general had struck him. He had straightened quickly, trying to collect himself, but his face was flushed and his mouth twitched at the corners with an effort not to react. His fingers massaged his cheek, and his gaze flicked anxiously toward the guests. Some were staring at him openly. Others were looking away, their discomfort barely masked. The officiant, an older man with wisps of white hair and a faint tremble in his hands, took an uncertain step forward. He cleared his throat, his voice dry and uncertain. "Perhaps we might all take a moment to collect ourselves," he offered, though it sounded more like a question than a directive. The musicians, clustered in the shade under a white canopy, looked at one another and began to quietly put down their instruments. One violinist, a young woman with red curls, wiped her eyes. The best man, Kyle, stepped forward, his face pale, and murmured something to Austin, but the groom didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the place where Naomi had stood just minutes earlier. He looked like a man trying to reconstruct the ruins of a building without realizing the foundation was already ash. Slowly, guests began to rise. Not all at once, but in small waves. Couples whispering to each other, mothers gathering children, older guests adjusting their shawls. The murmur of unease swelled into a soft tide of motion. No one dared to speak too loudly, but the message passed through the crowd with clarity. The ceremony was over. No one had declared it. There was no announcement. But everyone knew. Inside the estate, Naomi sat in a quiet drawing room just beyond the main hall. The door was closed and the lights were dimmed. Her wedding gown spilled across the armchair like a broken wave, and her veil had been removed and placed carefully on a nearby table. Her makeup was no longer perfect. A faint smudge of mascara stained the corner of one eye, and her lipstick had worn thin. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, fingers interlocked as though they were the only things holding her together. The general stood nearby, silent. He had offered no words of comfort since their brief exchange in the foyer, but his presence alone was enough. He remained still, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp in the soft light coming through the tall windows. Naomi could sense that he was giving her space, not only physical, but emotional. A kind of dignity that only those who had seen battle understood. The knowledge that healing could not be hurried, that silence was sometimes the kindest companion. At last she spoke. "Is it really over?" Her voice was barely audible. The general turned his head. "It was over the moment he put his hand on you." She nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "I thought I knew him." "You knew what he showed you, but the truth always waits. Sometimes it waits for the moment you most wish it wouldn't." Naomi looked down at her dress, at the delicate embroidery she had once spent hours choosing. It seemed foreign to her now, an ornate costume for a part she could no longer play. "He humiliated me in front of everyone," she whispered. The general's voice was quiet but firm. "He humiliated himself. You stood with grace, with restraint. That is strength." She turned toward him then, her eyes glistening. "Why did you let it go this far? Why didn't you stop me before?" "I couldn't make the decision for you," he replied. "I've fought wars, Naomi, but there's one thing I've learned. You cannot rescue someone from a lesson they are not ready to see. You had to walk that aisle, not to marry him, but to meet the truth." A silence passed between them, heavy but not suffocating. Naomi breathed it in. It was painful, but it wasn't paralyzing. It felt like a wound being cleaned, sharp, necessary, and oddly clarifying. Outside, the noise of departing cars and murmuring guests filtered through the thick estate walls. Naomi stood slowly and crossed to the window. The garden, once a picture of celebration, was now scattered with overturned chairs and trampled petals. The aisle lay bare. The altar, a grand construction of roses and ivy, stood like a monument to something that had never happened. She watched as Austin's parents were escorted to their vehicle, their expressions drawn and tight. A few of the groomsmen lingered near the steps, unsure what to do with their hands or their suits. Then she saw him, Austin, standing alone near the fountain, phone in hand, his head down. A moment later, he looked up toward the house, and for a heartbeat their eyes met across the distance. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. She simply watched him, unblinking, until he broke the gaze and turned toward the gate. "I don't know what to do next," she said, still staring through the glass. "You don't need to know yet," her grandfather answered. "You only need to take the first step. The rest will follow." That night, Naomi stayed in one of the estate's guest rooms. Her mother remained nearby, checking in quietly every hour, but never pushing. The guests had all departed, the staff had been dismissed early, and the estate had fallen into a hushed stillness. Naomi stood in front of the mirror in the private dressing area, wearing a simple robe. Her hair was let down, her face bare. She looked younger, but also older, as if she had stepped out of one life and into another. She thought of the months she had spent planning the wedding. The hours poring over floral arrangements, tasting cakes, choosing music, curating guest lists, the emails, the fittings, the anticipation, and all of it now distilled into a single moment. A slap, a cruel joke disguised as affection. A man so certain of his charm that he mistook her dignity for silence. And yet, she did not feel defeated. She felt hollow, yes, tired, yes. But inside, that exhaustion was something else. A flicker. A shape not yet formed. The faint outline of resolve. The next morning, as sunlight streamed into the room, Naomi woke before dawn. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in a shawl, and stepped barefoot onto the stone terrace outside the room. The air was cool, the sky just beginning to pale. She stood alone beneath the early light, listening to the birds begin their morning chorus. Footsteps approached behind her. She turned. The general, dressed in civilian clothes now, a simple dark coat and slacks, joined her. He said nothing at first, just stood beside her, watching the sunrise. "I don't want to go back to the apartment," Naomi said. "Not yet." "You don't have to." "I don't want to talk to anyone." "You don't have to do that either." She looked at him, studying the lines of his face, the way time and experience had carved his features into something steady and wise. "I want to understand how I got here," she said finally. "I want to understand how I missed it." He was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes, he said, we believe in people not because of who they are, but because of who we hope they might become. You saw the man you wanted him to be. He saw what he could get away with. Naomi closed her eyes. But you see him now, and you walked away. That's what matters. They stood in silence until the sky turned from pale gray to gold. Later that day, the general arranged for a car to take them back into the city. Naomi returned not as a bride, not as a woman humiliated, but as someone who had looked into a mirror and refused to lie to herself. She entered her apartment, took down the framed engagement photo on the hallway table, and replaced it with a picture of her father in uniform. She didn't cry, not this time. The silence of the apartment welcomed her. No more emails from the planner, no more fittings, no more pretending. It was over. But something else was about to begin. The apartment felt different. Naomi stood just inside the threshold, her hand resting lightly on the door as it clicked shut behind her. It was the same place she had left only 2 days ago, but something fundamental had shifted. The light that poured through the tall windows cast the same golden hues across the familiar furniture. The same art hung on the walls, and the scent of the vanilla diffuser still lingered faintly in the air. But it no longer felt like a space awaiting a bride. It felt like a sanctuary reclaimed. She took a slow breath and set down her bag. The silence was comforting now. Not heavy, not oppressive, just quiet. It gave her space to think, to process, to let the thoughts come without needing to shield herself from them. She stepped out of her shoes, letting her bare feet touch the hardwood floor, and walked slowly into the living room. The apartment was tidy, untouched during her absence, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for her to return and decide what would come next. The wedding dress still hung in the corner bedroom closet. She hadn't had the heart to look at it again, but she knew it was there, an echo of a version of herself that she had walked away from. A version who believed in something that turned out not to be love, but illusion. Not a shared future, but a performance. Her phone buzzed softly on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from the wedding planner, brief and courteous. So, sorry again for how things unfolded. Please let me know when you'd like to discuss next steps regarding vendors, refunds, and cancellations. She swiped the message away without replying. There had been many such messages, some from guests, some from colleagues. A few from extended family members who had heard whispers and now wanted details. But Naomi had spoken to no one since leaving the estate. Only her mother, who checked in every evening with a short, loving message, never pushing. Only her grandfather, who had said very little, but whose presence had spoken volumes. Naomi crossed the room and opened the window. The sounds of the city drifted in. Distant sirens, a bark of laughter from the sidewalk, a bus groaning to a stop. Life was continuing exactly as it always had, exactly as it would. The world did not pause for broken engagements or shamed grooms, and she was grateful for that, because somewhere in that relentless motion was the permission to move forward. She sat down on the sofa and finally allowed herself to exhale. The wedding was over. No, not over. Dismantled. Dismantled by truth, by revelation, by a single moment of unveiled cruelty that shattered everything in its path. It had not ended in vows or rings or music. It had ended with silence and a raised hand and the echo of her grandfather's footsteps on the aisle. And yet, she did not feel empty. She felt clean. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the absence of delusion, and that was something close. Later that afternoon, Naomi opened her laptop for the first time since the wedding. A part of her dreaded what she might see. The internet was merciless, and a wedding as high-profile as hers, attended by city officials, local celebrities, and public figures, was not going to vanish quietly. Her inbox was flooded. Headlines filled her screen within seconds. Viral wedding scandal, groom slaps bride during vows, general grandfather responds. The wedding that stopped Atlanta, how a decorated Army veteran saved his granddaughter's dignity. Respect, rage, and reckoning. What really happened at the Matthews-Ellis ceremony? There were videos, edited clips, blurred faces, commentary, hashtags, debates, op-eds. Everyone had an opinion. Some people condemned Austin. Others tried to explain his behavior as tone-deaf humor. But the overwhelming sentiment, clear even in the briefest skim of comment sections, was outrage. Outrage on Naomi's behalf, praise for her restraint, admiration for General Matthews. And Austin, he was being torn apart. His company, which had built its brand on progressive values and inclusive messaging, had released a formal statement distancing itself from the incident. By the next day, several clients had publicly pulled contracts. A popular podcast played the audio of the slap, followed by 10 seconds of silence, calling it the most deafening moment of 2025. Influencers weighed in. A popular actor reposted a clip with the caption, "Never put your hands on a woman, not even in jest, especially not on her wedding day, especially not this woman." Naomi closed the laptop. She wasn't interested in watching his downfall. It brought her no joy. There had been enough spectacle, enough attention. She didn't want to become a symbol or a trending story. She just wanted to go on with her life. And yet, the world had already decided otherwise. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. Naomi hesitated, then opened it slowly. A delivery man stood there holding a small, unmarked envelope. "For you," he said without looking her in the eye. She took it, thanked him, and closed the door. Inside was a letter, handwritten on ivory paper. "Naomi, I have no excuses, only shame. I will never ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that the person I was on that stage is the ugliest version of myself. I don't know what I was trying to prove. I only know that I proved the worst things. I'm sorry for humiliating you. I'm sorry for betraying what we had. I'm sorry for forgetting who you are. Please tell your grandfather I understand why he did what he did, and that he was right. Austin." She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer beside the engagement ring she no longer wore. That evening, her grandfather called. Not a text, not a visit, just a call. She picked up on the first ring. "How are you?" he asked, his voice steady. "I'm here," she answered. There was a pause. "I saw the headlines," he said. "I didn't ask for any of this. I know. But people are watching you now. I don't want them to. You may not have a choice in that, but you do have a choice in what you do next." His words hung in the air. "I've been thinking," Naomi said slowly, "about what you said, about taking the first step. Yes, I don't want this to define me, but I also don't want to pretend it didn't happen." There was silence on the line, the kind that signaled approval without embellishment. "I want to do something with it," she said. "Build something. Not for him. For women like me. Women who believe too long, who excuse too much, who smile when they should speak." "I'll help you," her grandfather said. And with that, the first stone was laid. The next week passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and planning sessions. Naomi contacted a lawyer friend who connected her with an advocacy organization specializing in emotional abuse and public humiliation in domestic relationships. She reached out to a former professor, now a dean at the university's architecture program, and shared her vision for a community space, part counseling center, part public forum, part architectural project. A space where women could come to reclaim their voices. The idea spread quickly. By the end of the second week, a major donor had reached out offering seed funding. A well-known designer offered to collaborate. A senator's wife sent a handwritten note of support. And Naomi, though still weary from the storm she had weathered, began to feel something she hadn't felt in weeks. Direction. The night before the first official planning meeting, Naomi sat in her apartment with her mother and grandfather. They had shared dinner, laughed softly over tea, now sat in the living room as the city lights blinked in the distance. Her grandfather spoke first. "You have changed." Naomi looked at him. "Is that a good thing?" "It's a necessary thing," he said. "Growth always hurts." Her mother reached over and took her hand. "Your pain became a beginning, Naomi. That's more than most people ever manage." Naomi squeezed her hand back. The weight of the wedding, the embarrassment, the slap, the silence, it was still there. But it no longer crushed her. It had been reshaped, not into bitterness, but into something solid, something useful. And that night, as she stood before the mirror again, the same mirror she had faced in her wedding gown, she saw not a bride left behind, but a woman standing in her own light. Alone, whole, and free. The headlines had not faded. Naomi had hoped the news cycle would move on, as it always did, that something louder, shinier, more controversial would capture the public's attention and pull it elsewhere. But the story of her wedding, the slap, the silence, the general, lingered like a question people couldn't stop asking. The footage, though brief and somewhat shaky, had etched itself into the collective memory of a digital world hungry for stories of outrage and redemption. There was something raw and arresting about it. A man humiliating a woman on what was meant to be the most sacred day of her life, and the quiet, powerful intervention that followed. She had done nothing to feed the attention. No interviews, no statements. She had refused requests from morning shows, podcast, feminist columnists, and one surprisingly persistent documentary filmmaker. She did not want to be a symbol. She did not want to be dissected, pitied, deified, or explained. She simply wanted to work. But the world had other plans. It started with an op-ed in a national newspaper, written by a well-known women's rights advocate. Naomi Ellis walked away so others could see the door. The article praised her grace, her strength, and most notably, her silence. It spoke of dignity and restraint, the clarity in not answering cruelty with spectacle. The piece went viral. Then came the interviews from guests who had attended the wedding, a city councilwoman, a local television anchor, a famous chef. They described the moment of the slap, the stunned silence, the presence of General Matthews. They recounted how Naomi had not wept, had not flinched, had simply walked away. People shared it as a parable, a warning, a lesson. Some used it to launch broader conversations about emotional abuse, respectability, racial power dynamics, and the veneer of progressive relationships. Austin disappeared from the public eye for nearly 2 weeks. His company removed his profile from their website. Anonymous sources claimed he was taking an indefinite leave. A blurry photo of him at an airport surfaced online, carrying a duffel bag and looking disheveled. Rumors circulated that he had left the state, possibly even the country. Naomi didn't care to confirm them. What did reach her, however, was the letter. Not the first one, the earlier, handwritten apology she had already tucked away and tried to forget, but a second. This time from a woman named Claire. Naomi received it via email, forwarded to her by the advocacy group she had begun working with. Claire introduced herself as someone who had once dated Austin years before he met Naomi. Her tone was careful but heartfelt. "I saw the video," she wrote, "and I saw you. And I needed you to know I've been there, not on a stage in front of hundreds, but in private, in rooms where no one could see. I didn't know how to leave. I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was the problem. When I saw you walk away, I cried, because it made me realize how long I'd been standing still." Naomi read the message in full, then read it again. There were others. Dozens of them. Some from women who had been in public relationships with powerful men and endured quiet, cruel humiliations behind closed doors. Others from young women, university students, who saw Naomi as proof that it was possible to draw a line, to reclaim the narrative, to begin again. She had not meant to inspire anyone, but she could not ignore the effect. The first time she stood in front of a room again, it was for a closed forum hosted by the advocacy organization. There were only 20 women, seated in a circle in a sunlit room with high ceilings and pale blue walls. Naomi had come as a listener. She had brought a notebook intending to observe. But the coordinator had introduced her warmly, and the women had looked at her with such quiet expectation that she felt compelled to speak. "I didn't know," she said, her voice low but clear. "I didn't know what was happening until it was too late to pretend I didn't. I thought I was smart enough to see it coming. I thought if someone humiliated me, it would be obvious. Ugly, loud, but it wasn't. It was small things, jokes, looks, words that sounded like love but weren't. It built slowly, and by the time I understood, I was already wearing a dress." There had been silence. And then one woman across from her, middle-aged with silver hair and a scar on her cheek, whispered, "I didn't wear the dress, but I wore the silence." From there, the conversation opened like a door Naomi hadn't known existed. They shared, cautiously at first, then with more certainty. Pain was passed gently between them like a fragile heirloom, and no one flinched. Naomi left the room feeling something stir in her chest, a quiet, steady fire. Her grandfather watched her with careful pride. He never interfered, never hovered, but he asked questions. He listened. And once, when they sat alone in her kitchen after one such event, he said, "It's not just what you walked away from that matters, it's what you're walking toward." That thought became the seed of a new vision. Naomi decided to build something tangible. Not just meetings or forums, but a space, a real place. She imagined it clearly. High ceilings, wide windows, warm wood, soft light. A place where women could come to tell their stories. A place for healing. A place for power. With help from her old professor, she designed the plans herself. She called it the Threshold. The Threshold would be part counseling center, part resource hub, part event space. It would host workshops, legal clinics, mental health resources, and panels. But more than that, it would be a sanctuary, a place not just for recovery, but for recalibration. When she pitched the concept at a women's leadership summit, the room erupted in applause. She was offered immediate partnerships, donations, volunteer teams. The city approved the zoning within weeks. A tech entrepreneur pledged the seed funding. A senator's office inquired about speaking at the opening. But with attention came criticism. Some accused Naomi of capitalizing on her trauma, of turning pain into brand, of benefiting from a moment that had gone viral. Anonymous posts claimed she had planned it all, staged the slap, prompted the general, edited the video. A fringe blogger published an article titled "The Weaponization of the Bride," suggesting that Naomi had used white guilt and military gravitas to destroy a man's life. Naomi did not respond, but the attacks wore on her. Some nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had done the right thing by staying visible, if she had helped too many, if she had helped at all. The clarity she once felt now sat behind a veil of exhaustion. She worked 12-hour days, answered every email, managed logistics, met with architects, and reviewed material costs. But beneath the surface, she felt the fatigue settling in her bones. Her grandfather noticed. One evening, he brought dinner to her apartment. He did not ask how she was feeling. He simply sat beside her, watched her take 2 bites of food, and then said, "You're running like you're still being chased." Naomi looked up. "Aren't I?" He didn't smile. "Only if you believe they're still behind you." She set her fork down. "What if I disappoint everyone? What if they think I'm just a story?" "You are," he said, "but stories change people. That's why they survive." He paused. "And you're not here to perform. You're here to build. That's the difference." Naomi closed her eyes. The backlash didn't stop, but she no longer let it guide her. Instead, she poured her energy into the launch, into the final blueprints, into the hiring of staff, the planning of the inaugural event, the selection of the first women who would walk through the doors of the threshold not as victims, but as survivors, speakers, and leaders. The night before the launch, Naomi walked through the finished space alone. The air was scented with fresh paint and eucalyptus. The floors gleamed. The walls were lined with artwork from women across the city, painters, poets, sculptors, photographers. Each piece told a story of emergence, of reclamation. She stood at the center of the main room, beneath a skylight, and looked up into the night. She did not cry. She simply breathed. Tomorrow would be public again. There would be press and politicians and faces turned toward her with expectation. There would be light and microphones and the memory of a slap that had never truly faded. But tonight there was silence, and she was no longer afraid of it. The morning of the launch arrived clear and cool, the kind of morning Naomi used to believe only existed in film scenes or old novels, a quiet kind of perfect, unmarred by chaos or complication. The sun had not yet climbed fully into the sky when she awoke, but light already filtered through her bedroom windows, pale and crisp. There were no birdsong melodies or orchestrated nature sounds, just stillness, just breath, and a strange but welcome sense of readiness. She sat at the edge of her bed for a long time before standing. Her feet touched the floor like she was feeling it for the first time. No rush, no list, no noise in her head. There would be cameras today, flashing lights, speeches, people watching her every move again. Not with pity anymore, but with reverence, expectation, curiosity. Naomi had been many things in the public eye over the last several months: a bride humiliated, a symbol of defiance, a vessel for meaning people projected onto her. But today she would be something different. She would simply be herself. She dressed in black, soft, structured, understated. A long-sleeved jumpsuit with a tailored waist and no jewelry, aside from a slim gold bracelet that had once belonged to her grandmother. Her hair was swept into a low twist, no veil, no embellishment, no mask. The woman who looked back at her in the mirror was the one who had walked through fire and decided not to burn. Her mother called to check in. The conversation was brief. They didn't need many words between them anymore. Janice had offered to accompany her, but Naomi had gently declined. This was something she needed to do alone, not because she was afraid, and not because she lacked support, but because the beginning of something true needed to belong to her fully. When she arrived at the threshold, the street was already filling with cars. Volunteers wore black shirts and soft smiles, ushering attendees into the space. The building itself, formerly a warehouse, now stood transformed. Its exterior was painted a warm ivory with vertical wooden panels along the sides, and tall glass windows reflected the rising sun. A bronze plaque near the entrance read simply, "The Threshold," founded by Naomi Ellis, in honor of every woman who has ever been asked to stay silent. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. The atrium was filled with light, filtered through a skylight Naomi had insisted on designing herself. The floors gleamed in soft oak. The walls were adorned with artwork by women from across the country, portraits, abstract expressions, poetry printed in bold typography. Everywhere she turned, Naomi saw life, breath, emergence. The first visitors were already wandering quietly through the main gallery space, reading the pieces, some nodding, some crying, some simply standing in stillness. Staff guided guests toward the auditorium for the opening remarks. Rows of seats filled quickly. Activists, survivors, politicians, educators, students, mothers with daughters, men with quiet expressions of regret or resolve. In the front row sat her mother, composed and proud, and beside her, as if carved from marble and iron, sat General Lawrence Matthews. He wore a simple navy suit, pressed and immaculate, with only a single medal pinned discreetly to the lapel. He had refused interviews. He had never spoken about what happened at the wedding. But everyone in the room knew exactly who he was. When Naomi stepped onto the stage, there was no dramatic entrance music, no amplified applause. Just footsteps. Just presence. The room stood, not in obligatory respect, but in shared reverence. Naomi stood behind the podium, placed both hands on its edge, and waited for the room to settle. She looked out over the crowd, faces of every shape, shade, and story, strangers who now felt like kin. A breath rose in her chest, not with fear, but with a feeling close to gratitude. She began. "There was a time, not long ago, when I stood in front of a crowd like this in a white dress. My hair was perfect. My smile was rehearsed. My heart was full. I believed I was walking into the beginning of something beautiful." Her voice did not shake. I was wrong. Silence greeted her, not the silence of discomfort, the silence of attention. I was wrong because I mistook performance for partnership. I mistook cruelty for charm. I mistook silence for peace. And when that illusion shattered, publicly, painfully, I thought I would disappear. She let the words breathe. But something else happened. Something unexpected. I found clarity. I found my voice. And I found you. She looked out again, letting her eyes rest briefly on her grandfather's face, then on her mother's. This building was never meant to be mine. It was meant to be yours. All of yours. Every woman who has ever been diminished, doubted, mocked, erased, told to be quieter, softer, smaller. This is for you. This is for us. Applause followed, soft at first, then rising like a wave. Naomi didn't linger on the stage. She stepped back with a nod, allowing the next speaker to approach. She hadn't come to perform. She had come to build. After the ceremony, she moved through the crowd without a spotlight. Guests greeted her, thanked her, told her pieces of their own stories. A woman in her 70s, eyes damp with tears, gripped Naomi's hands and whispered, "You gave me back something I thought was lost." A young girl in a yellow dress asked for a photo, then handed her a folded piece of paper with a drawing of Naomi wearing a cape. She found herself back in the main hall, staring up at the skylight. Then came the press. Carefully arranged interviews, questions rehearsed, polite, but always edged with curiosity. Was she still in contact with Austin? No. Would the general speak today? No. Did she believe forgiveness was possible? "Forgiveness is personal," she replied, "but boundaries are necessary." They asked if she felt vindicated. "No," she said, "I feel focused." They asked what her next step was. Naomi smiled. "I've already taken it." That evening, long after the crowds had dispersed, Naomi remained. She walked through the now empty halls of the threshold, her heels echoing softly on the wood floors. She stood in the reflection room where a wall of names had been etched in gold. Survivors, founders, allies, healers. Her name was last, not larger than the rest, just last. A small plaque beneath read, "For walking away." She stepped outside into the night air where her grandfather waited at the curb. He opened the door of the car for her, but before she entered, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said simply. He gave a short nod. "You needed to walk through the fire, but you didn't walk through it alone." They rode in silence most of the way home, but it wasn't the old kind of silence, the tense, uncertain quiet of doubt. It was comfortable, certain, shared. At her apartment, she stood on the balcony alone, watching the city shimmer beneath her. She had not expected to stand here months after a wedding that never was, wearing black, holding no bouquet, bearing no ring. But the woman she had become didn't belong to any altar. She belonged to herself. And that was more than enough. She did not need applause. She did not need redemption. She did not need the world to remember her for one moment at the end of a ruined ceremony. Let them remember her for what came after. Let them remember her for what she built. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next video for another powerful journey, and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.